California task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Mass incarceration has been catastrophic to the ability of black families to build and maintain wealth by reducing household assets and income, and lowering homeownership rates as discussed in detail in Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System. The criminalization of African Americans has contributed to racial disparities at every step of the criminal justice system. In 2019, African Americans comprised 26% of all arrests, yet they only made up 13.4% of the population 172 according to a recent large-scale analysis of racial disparities in over 60 million state patrol police stops in 20 states, including California. Researchers found that police officers stop African Americans more often than white drivers relative to their share of the driving age population 173. Further, these researchers found that, after controlling for age, gender, time, and location, police are more likely to ticket, search, and arrest African American drivers than white Americans 174. Thus, in practice, the bar for searching African American drivers is lower than for searching white Americans 175. Low family wealth can also mean being unable to afford additional education and delaying entering the labor market, leading to higher risks of incarceration 176. Once a person is a criminal defendant, low family wealth makes it hard to post bond or to hire lawyers to help navigate the criminal justice system, making incarceration more likely 177. In 2009, African Americans made up less than 13% of the U.S. population, but comprised over a third of all the people in prison 178. As explained in Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System, African Americans are also more likely to be convicted and experience lengthy prison sentences 179. Involvement in the criminal justice system increases legal debt 180. Incarceration means loss of income and may lead to missed mortgage payments and other debts 181. This increases interest obligations and penalties, which in turn can send an incarcerated individual's credit score plummeting 182. Incarceration also means household instability, placing an additional barrier to building wealth 183. As Chapter 11 explains, federal and state prisons continue to exploit the labor of predominantly black incarcerated people 184. While convict leasing as an official practice has ended, underpaid or unpaid prison labor continues today as incarcerated people are not protected by labor laws 185. For example, in-house prison labor, the most common type of prison labor, typically refers to jobs within and related to the prison including kitchen duty, cleaning, or groundskeeping. 186 workers can be punished and sent to solitary confinement for taking a sick day, including in the 8 states where the labor is unpaid, 187 in states where prison labor is paid. The average rates across the U.S. range from 14 to 63 cents per hour. These are the rates before wage garnishment, which can account for up to half of one's earnings. Although some advocates argue that wage garnishment serves as appropriate sources for victims' restitution 188. In addition to jobs within the prison, incarcerated people also provide underpaid and unprotected industry labor unrelated to maintaining the prison, like phone banking, packaging, and textile work. 189 participating private companies must pay minimum wage. WICTI prison garnishes for the incarcerated person's room and board in prison cells 190. The garnishment only applies to basic room and board, and the incarcerated person must pay additionally for stamps, paper, toiletries, supplementary food, or phone calls. 191 advocates argue that such costs are not fairly calculated and that the American criminal justice system is filled with fees that shift the costs of incarceration not only to the incarcerated, but also to their families. 192. Scholars argue that work programs in incarceration are not beneficial to incarcerated people when they seek work after their incarceration. 193. Once released from incarceration, criminal convictions make it harder to find and maintain jobs, find leases, and be approved for mortgages. 194. A record of previous incarceration also has wide-ranging immediate and future consequences that act as a barrier to employment, thus lowering Earnings 195. A criminal conviction makes it difficult to build wealth because of stigmatization and lack of access to supportive social institutions and credit. 196. Once released, criminal convictions make it harder for returning citizens to find and maintain jobs, find leases, and be approved for mortgages. Exclusion and discrimination in government benefits. African Americans have consistently been excluded from numerous major categories of government benefits, which have generally benefited white Americans. Government benefits refer to assistance programs that provide either cash assistance or in-kind benefits to individuals and families from a governmental entity. There are two major types of government benefit programs: social welfare programs and social insurance programs. Benefits received from social welfare programs are usually based on low income. Benefits received from social insurance programs are usually based on other criteria, such as age, employment status, or being a veteran. Some of the major federal, state, and local social insurance programs are Social Security, Veterans Benefits, Unemployment Insurance Compensation, and Workers' Compensation. Social insurance programs can provide important support in times of crisis. Unemployment insurance, a state-level program, helps protect against unexpected drops in income by paying cash benefits to unemployed workers who have lost jobs through no fault of their own. 197. The Federal Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as food stamps, gives money to low-income families to buy food and expands to provide important support when people lose their jobs. 198. Recipients have improved food security, health, and reduced health care expenses. 199. Historically, federal policy decisions dealing with welfare, work, and war in the 1930s and 1940s excluded or discriminated against the vast majority of African Americans. 200. The exclusion and discrimination continued due to the congressional representatives elected from southern states that created barriers to African Americans voting. 201. Among other things, Southern legislators prevented Congress from including anti-discrimination provisions in an expansive range of social welfare programs, such as community health services, school lunches, and hospital construction grants, all the programs that distributed funds to the South. 202. As a result, when federal policies provided most white Americans with valuable tools to build wealth, ensure their old age, get good jobs, acquire economic security, build assets, and gain middle-class status, most African Americans were left out. 203. Social Security, passed and signed by President Roosevelt in 1935. Left out most African Americans for the first quarter-century of its existence. 204. Southern congressional representatives heavily influenced the Social Security Act with devastating results. 205. The federal government gave the power to control benefit levels, eligibility, and administration of such programs to the states and included occupations mostly held by African Americans. 206. At the time, 65% of African Americans fell outside of eligibility for the Social Security program, and between 70 and 80% fell outside eligibility requirements in different parts of the South. 207. For example, in 1940, the year Social Security payments for seniors began, the Social Security Board identified nearly 3 million black workers as eligible for old age insurance. But the majority of those identified were disqualified because they were farm or domestic workers. 208. These exclusions continued until 1954, when the occupational exclusions were eliminated. 209. This exclusion also left most black workers out of unemployment insurance under the Act. 210. When black workers qualified by working in eligible industrial and commercial jobs, they often were left out because they lacked a history of regular, stable employment. 211. When they received benefits, the benefits tended to be smaller than those received by white workers. 212. Another example of federal government discrimination in benefits are the mortgage subsidies, which not only intensified residential segregation as discussed in detail in Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, but also helped white families build wealth and enter the middle class. The federal government supported the creation and maintenance of the white middle class through other programs as well. The New Deal was a collection of government programs with the goal of lifting America out of the Great Depression. 213. One example of a New Deal policy was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill. which was reinforced in 1948 with the integration of the Armed Forces Act. Through these laws, the federal government aimed to offer unprecedented benefits to veterans, including mortgages to buy homes, job placement services, money for vocational and university education, and loans for small businesses. 214. However, these programs were administered by the states, which discriminated against Southern black veterans. 215. While white World War II veterans sent themselves and their children to college and obtained housing and small business grants, black veterans were not able to do so in the same way. 216. Historically, federal policy decisions dealing with welfare, work, and war excluded or discriminated against the vast majority of African Americans. Part of this stemmed from discrimination in the military. Black soldiers were more likely to be issued neutral and dishonorable discharges, sometimes used to exclude black veterans from GI Bill benefits. 217. Ira Katznelson argues that severe discrimination in the GI Bill administration system prevented black veterans from obtaining home mortgages, small business and farm loans. 218. Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity, discusses how other New Deal programs excluded African Americans in detail. Today, African American families continue to have trouble accessing government benefits because welfare programs are often administered at the state and local levels. State and especially local governments have been able to introduce racial bias into welfare administration, contributing to racially disparate outcomes. 219 states have been significantly more likely to both adopt and impose welfare sanctions if they have higher proportions of non-white welfare recipients. 220 states with higher black populations, generally in the South, tend to provide fewer unemployment payments for a shorter time. 221. Additionally, in many places, part-time workers, who are disproportionately black, are not eligible for unemployment payments. 222. Despite having higher unemployment rates in general, black workers receive unemployment benefits at lower rates than white Americans. 223. A report by the Government Accountability Office found that 73% of black unemployment applicants received unemployment payments during the pandemic versus 82% of white applicants. 224. Although governments have waived work requirements for some SNAP recipients during certain national crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, studies have found that work requirements disproportionately cut off black adults from SNAP benefits, which may be partially due to discrimination in the labor market, making the job search more difficult for black people. 225. During the COVID-19 pandemic, most households received several stimulus checks from the federal government. Studies have found that these payments were likely crucial to help households that lost jobs that pay their expenses. 226. The federal government supplemented state unemployment payments with up to $600 per week for unemployed workers, extended the duration of benefits, and gave benefits to workers traditionally left out of unemployment insurance programs. 227. The federal government also instituted the Paycheck Protection Program to provide loans that enable businesses suffering from COVID-19's economic shocks to pay their employees and other costs. 228. During the pandemic, even though African Americans were more likely to hold the types of jobs most severely impacted by the pandemic, white households received their COVID-19 stimulus checks faster than black households. 229. Social Security, passed and signed by President Roosevelt in 1935, left out most African Americans, and scholars have argued that it was characterized by a form of policy apartheid for the first quarter-century of its existence. Protesters at the landmark civil rights demonstration, the March on Washington, courtesy of Wally McNamee, Corbus via Getty Images. This was likely due to the Internal Revenue Service-focused structure of the program, which made receiving the payment more complicated for unbanked families and families who did not file taxes. Black people are more likely to be among both groups. 230. Studies of pandemic-era federal loans have found that 29% of black applicants were successful in obtaining loans for their businesses versus 60% of white applicants. 231. Businesses in majority black neighborhoods were also more likely to receive federal loans later than businesses in majority white neighborhoods. 232. Federal money was paid out through large banks, which historically excluded black businesses. 233. Black business owners may have been less likely to obtain them, despite being more likely than white business owners to have at-risk or distressed businesses even before the pandemic. 234. Education segregation and debt. Higher education for African Americans can have a positive effect on their income, but does not translate into a reduction in the wealth gap. 235 college degrees do little to close the racial wealth gap. 236 For example, college-educated African American households have 30 to 33% less wealth at the median than non-college-educated white households. Average wealth for white Americans in this category is $180,500, while the African American average is $23,437. As Rucker C. Johnson testified before the Reparations Task Force, affluent black households with incomes above $75,000 still live in more under-resourced neighborhoods with under-resourced school than their white counterparts, which disadvantages black students from the start of childhood. 238. Black students carry more student loan debt because they receive a higher interest on their student loans, and they borrow more because their families are less wealthy than white students. 239 For example, 20 to 29-year-old single white women who have completed college have a median net worth of $3,400. Single black women of a similar age and level of education have a median net worth of -$11,000. 240. Labor market discrimination. Income is different from wealth. Income represents how much a person earns in a lifetime, both from work and from a yearly return on their investments. 241 Wealth represents a person's total net worth calculated from assets minus debts. 242 While income plays a modest role in the ability to generate wealth, as lower income translates to reduced capacity for savings or investments, income does not explain massive black-white wealth disparities in the United States without savings or wealth of some form, which can be passed from generation to generation. Economic stability quickly falls apart when income is cut or disrupted through job loss, reduced work hours or reduced wages, or if families suffer from an unexpected health emergency. 243 In fact, the intergenerational transfer and impact of wealth is one of the reasons why racial wealth inequities have become entrenched. 244. As detailed in Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity. Labor market discrimination significantly contributes to the wealth gap. 245 Some scholars have based their estimates for reparations on more recent economic injustices such as labor market discrimination. 246 Bernadette Shashir and Gerald Adinsky estimated the monetary benefits that white workers gained from employment discrimination between 1929 and 1969. 247 They concluded that by the mid-1980s, white workers gained in $1.6 trillion from employment discrimination at the expense of black workers, assuming that 40% of the black-white income gap was because of labor market discrimination. 248. David Swinton concludes that even if one subtracted the total cost of government benefits programs including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, and other welfare programs, which are often argued to be reparations, over the same time span from the Shashir and Adinsky estimate, there would still be a $500 billion net benefit to white people from labor market discrimination by the mid-1980s. 249. But, income alone cannot explain the racial wealth gap. A reduction in racial differences in income would leave as much as 3/4 of the wealth gap unaddressed. 250. Similar achievements do not lead to similar wealth for African Americans in comparison to white Americans. 251 For example, between 1984 and 2009, every dollar increase in average income for white households added $5.19 in wealth. The same increase in average incomes for African American households added only $0.69 in wealth. 252. In fact, the racial wealth gap increases as income increases. The wealth gap between African Americans and whites in the bottom fifth of income levels is $7,400, but the wealth gap between comparable African Americans and whites in the top fifth of income levels is $264,700. 253 And while white households have 5 to 10 times the net worth of African American households, they only earn twice as much as African American households. 254 Within the same income brackets, African American wealth is less than one-half that of white people. 255 White people in the bottom fifth of the income distribution have more than 10 times the median wealth of African Americans in the bottom fifth. 256 Lower incomes for African Americans because of labor market discrimination affect wealth only to the extent that it reduces capacity for savings that can be passed across generations. There is no evidence that African Americans have a lower savings rate than white Americans once household income is Taken into account 257. One study found that once income is taken into account, if anything, African American families actually have a slightly higher savings rate than their white counterparts. 258. In fact, white households spend 1.3 times as much as African American households with similar incomes. 259. At high income levels, African Americans save more than white people who tend to invest. 260. In addition to savings from income or active savings, a family's wealth can also increase because of passive savings, or when the value of a family's assets rises or appreciates. Data collected before the predatory subprime mortgage market crisis shows that there is no significant racial advantage in passive savings for white families with positive assets after family income is taken into account. 261. College degrees do little to close the racial wealth gap. For example, college-educated African American households have 30 to 33% less wealth at the median than non-college educated white households. Average wealth for white Americans in this category is $180,500, while the African American average is $23,400.